So I'm live, and what I want to talk about in this video is playing the game. It's a lesson I learned a long time ago. It's one of the, I think, things that really bothers me about academia. Uh, One day I went to lunch with a friend, and he was in a really bad mood. So I said, what's up? And he said, well, he had applied for a summer research grant. Now I have ECU, where I was teaching then, teaching now. Summer research grants gave you basically summer money without having to teach. The idea was you put in a proposal for a trip, a research trip, usually overseas in our field, and then you get the money and you use that to basically fund your research trip. And the preferences go usually to untenured professors, which he was at the time. I wasn't chair then, I was just a tenured associate professor. So I said, well, they're tough to get. I'd been turned down many times myself. And he said, yeah, but he said, here's the list of the ones that were funded. Now, what was he doing? He was doing, his proposal was to go to Russia, which was much more open than the Soviet archives, to get into the Gulag archives and to look at the numbers and the things that had happened to the Ukrainians during the famine. Now, everybody knows millions of Ukrainians were starved to death by Stalin in the Ukrainian famine. The numbers vary, a low of 6, I've seen as high as 15, probably around 8, maybe 11, who knows, somewhere in there. But there were hundreds of thousands of other Ukrainians, and he wasn't sure how many, who had been shipped to Siberia, where they were sent to the Gulag, and they worked there for years, decades, or in many cases to death. And he wanted to do research on the Ukrainians who didn't die but were sent to Siberia. So this is a pretty big deal in European history. I mean, this is more people died in the Ukrainian famine than Jews died in the Holocaust. I mean, now there's more Ukrainians than there were European Jews. So proportionally, it wasn't as bad. But still, I mean, we're talking here, millions of dead people purposely starved to death, and then those who weren't starved to death being shipped to Siberia, where many of them perished there under horrible conditions. This was the Gulag. And he said, look at the ones that got funded. Now, other than the ones in the hard sciences, physics and stuff like that, basically all the ones in the social sciences and humanities dealt with gender or sexuality. I think everyone on the list, somebody was doing, lesbianism in 1923 Paris on the left bank of the Seine River or something like that. They were all funded. His wasn't. So he was upset. He thought that, based on his appreciation of history, his contribution would be much more important than some of these other contributions, which seemed actually relatively, some of them, not all, but some of them seemed pretty petty. So he was really upset. So it struck me. I said to him, were half the Ukrainians probably who were sent to Siberia by Stalin women? He said, yeah, probably, maybe even more than half, because a lot of the men were killed. I said, well, I got an idea. And I said, when we get back to the office, print me out a copy of your proposal and then come down to my office and we'll meet there. Now, I'd gotten a couple of days before this 2-volume anthology on women in America, a collection of chapters and articles written by feminists and everything. And I picked it up. I thought maybe I could use it for my course. I teach U.S. history, and I'd gone through, and I'd gotten like halfway through the introduction, and I put it down. It was just jargon term, jargon term, jargon term, jargon term, jargon term. It was so much. It was just overly jargoned, and I thought this is nonsense to write this way. I mean, the points were fine, the points were valid, the information was good, but why do you have to couch it in jargon? I'm a military historian, and sometimes you just try to write clearly. You don't want to write always in jargon where you're just going to lose people. So while I was waiting for him, I went through the introduction again with a yellow highlighter, and I highlighted all the jargon terms. as I went along until I had 20. I didn't even finish. I mean, there was so many. It didn't take me more than a few pages to get up to 20 terms. And then using those, I went to the second volume, which had the index in it. And I went to the index and checked out those 20 terms in the index to see how many times they'd been used. You know, I counted the number of articles in the anthology. There, I think, there were like 15. And I went and I was looking for ones that were mentioned at least 15 times. So some of them were like 47, 53. I mean, they were just used several times in each article. So the ones I had a list at the end of 12 most used, in my view, abused jargon terms in that anthology. Meanwhile, he'd come back down with his proposal. It was only like 3 pages or something, maybe 4. I don't know. I don't remember. This was close to 15 years ago. And I went through his proposal and I read it. And then as I reread it the second time, I tried to figure out where I could fit in these 12 jargon terms at least once. Many of them I fit in, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. So when I was done with this, he had his proposal and I had penciled in 12 jargon terms from feminist idea. And of course, we changed the title to Ukrainians Sent to Siberia to Women Ukrainians Sent to Siberia. But it was basically the same proposal. He was going to do the same thing. You had to go through the same records. It's not like in the Gulag, they broke out the records, one way or the other to help you, find gender issues. So he had that, he cleaned it up, and then we had to wait until it was time to resubmit. Well, it might have been next year. I don't remember. And he's resubmitted it as we had reworked it, working in all the feminist jargon and changing the title. Time passed, and then one day I'm in my office, and there he is with a big smile on his face, and he's got this letter that he had just come through the mail, and he said he was going to buy me lunch. And he said, not only did I get the grant, but they're sending a congratulatory letter to the department chair, to our department chair, pointing out how great it was to see that this young faculty member had demonstrated his commitment to diversity and gendered issues and whatever. The whole letter was filled with jargon to top it off with. So he got the grant. And then ultimately that summer he went to Russia and he did his research. But to me, the lesson was clear that this grant thing was a game. It wasn't a question of how good was your idea. This was, do you check all the boxes? Did you use the proper jargon? Do you sound like you're committed to diversity? And then, again, this is 15 years ago. It's worse now. But that's how grant funding works. That's why 96% of all the scientists believe in global warming. 96% of scientists believe in global warming because if they don't, they won't get grant funding. I mean, I knew a guy who when I first met him was doing global cooling, the fear of an instant ice age coming, which is a pretty big fear. Much worse, would be much worse for the planet than global warming. But now he's doing global warming. And why? Because nobody's going to fund him anymore. And if you want to do funding, you do global warming. And that's the way the funding works. And it's just a game. It's rigged. You have to say the right words. It's not a question of how good is your idea. Is it, can you dress it up in the proper jargon? Can you fit it into the quest for gender and sexuality, or diversity, or racism, or whatever? And then you're more likely to get funding than if you just say, well, this is an important issue, and I think it should be studied, and you should support me so I can do this research to help me move along toward tenure. But that's not how it works, and it's a game. And it's a joke. It's almost a joke. I mean, the shame of it is we had essentially played a joke on that committee, and they supported him with funding to go do his research. And you see these stories about people who write these phony social science articles proving that the universe doesn't exist, or whatever, and then it turns out that they're hoaxes because nobody checked the sources, nobody checked the logic behind the article. It's just if you put in the right jargon and you say the right things, chop 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 chop, you just check it off, and you get what you're shooting for, which in this case is to get published. And I see it happen in my field, military history. More and more I pick up stuff, and increasingly you see a ever larger percentage of books and articles being published deal with issues of gender and sexuality and race, and that's just the way it goes even in my field. I've said it and I mean it. I'm sincere in this. I mean, I have 40 years teaching experience. I published 12 books, which is a hell of a lot of books for a historian. The average is less than two. Uh, 2 dozen articles. I brought in hundreds of thousands of dollars in grants, and I spent 12 years chairing 3 academic departments. And I can't be, they won't even consider me for distinguished professor on this campus, although other people got it for far, far less. And it's because I don't do the right things. I'm not doing diversity. I'm not doing gender. I'm not doing sexuality. And moreover, what's really sad is, and I'm gonna leave in probably 3 to 5 years, maybe less. Who knows? I'm gonna retire. I can retire. I could retire now if I want. But when I step down, if I step down and under an assumed name applied to replace myself, assuming the position gets returned to the department, which it probably won't. But if it did, and I applied under a different name, using my resume and my experience, 12 books, 2 dozen articles, 12 years as an administrator, 40 years of teaching experience, I won't get hired. I don't have a commitment to diversity. I'm not out doing social justice work. I'm not doing any of these things. I couldn't even compete for the job I have now. Instead, it would go to somebody who has published, far less, or in some cases, probably nothing. But that's where we're at today in academia, and it's a shame. I mean, I really, and I've said this, and I'm not joking. I think it's up on my Facebook post. I said if I could do it over again, I would. I mean, there was a time back almost 50 years ago where I had an option to do something entirely different into business, and I wish I had. I wish I had not gone into academia. And I don't say that as somebody who's failed. I mean, I'm a full professor, 12 books, 24 articles. I mean, what more can you do? I mean, I ended up accomplishing far more than I ever thought. When I decided to go for my PhD, somebody said to me, "Someday you're going to publish your 12th book." I was, you got to be crazy. I'll be lucky if I do too. I mean, yet I did all that, and despite all that, despite the fact that I was chair for 8 years and 3 different departments, 12 years, if you count the 3. Despite all that, if I could go back and do it again, I would. I'd do it differently because I'm sitting here looking at a profession that's destroying itself. I see my own department cycling down into a it's like watching something you dropped into the toilet heading down toward the bottom of the bowl. I mean, it's really depressing when I think about how much effort I put into all this, and like, for what? I mean, it's just become a sad joke to somebody who's been teaching about the founding, and teaching about liberties, and teaching about free speech, and teaching about the centrality of rights, to see all these things just trashed in academia, where people like me, if I was invited to speak on a campus, people probably oppose it, try to stop it, or shut me down. I mean, that's the way it's gotten. And I just keep waiting, sooner or later somebody's going to try to prevent me from teaching. So I think it's a question of when, how long I can go. But it's really sad. And I think it's doubly sad to say that, yeah, if I could go back to when I was 19 or 20 and I was offered that opportunity, uh, if I could go back and do that, I would have taken it. I would take it today in a second, and I would give up everything that I've achieved in this profession, because it's a profession that's dying and it's killing itself. We have met the enemy and we are us. And I've watched it kill itself now almost since I was an undergraduate. And it's very sad.